Kohsuke and me were listening to Snoop Dogg, and we really couldn't make out anything. And the comment there was, well, you are really a nerd if you can understand JSON better than Snoop Dogg's, literally.
And so he said that, and I actually put that on Twitter, like overheard, right? JSON is easier to parse than Snoop Dogg. And the Snoop Dogg actually retweeted that, so that's my like a 5-second of fame. All right, shall we get going? Yeah. So, oh, this doesn't look good.
Already in use.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, yeah, but I did specify the port. Oh, I see. Oh, I know, sorry.
You won't help me debugging that?
Okay, this should be good. All right. All right, so I guess we will get going. So I'm Kohsuke, and so I have the Harpreet Singh with me. He's the senior director of product marketing, and also the guy who makes me work. So today, I guess in this talk, I wanted to talk more about what we've been doing in the CloudBees, because we love Jenkins, and we do things inside Jenkins. On top of it, we do things around it. There's all sort of pretty exciting stuff going on. So I just couldn't resist the temptation to talk about it. So the first one that I want to spend some time on is the Literate build. And I touched this in just a few hours earlier, but this project came from my colleague Stephen Conley, who works in Dublin, Ireland. And then when he's not drinking, he hacks on the code. And he's a long-time contributor to the Jenkins project. And every so often he comes up with this entirely new ideas that, like, I don't even know what to do, but like, you know, if you let him do his thing, he'd produce some amazing stuff. So the weather icon, for example, is one of his creation. So his problem was that we are using Git for main development. And in Git, it's really easy to create branches. So in some development model around Git, it really actively embraces this notion of creating a short-lived branches. But Stephen noticed that the creating jobs inside Jenkins isn't as easy as Git is making it easy for branching. So in a typical Git environment, you might probably have like at least one very active branch, let's say master, and then you might manually have a continuous integration job that's monitoring things on top of it. But as you create your branches left and right, you still have to go in and manually create Jenkins job for these branches. And if you're talking about, like a long living branches or some stable, like a common pattern, like a stable branch that you expect to be there for a long time, then this cost might not be too much. But if you're talking about really short-lived branches, like a feature branch or that sort of thing, then the overhead might be too much that you might actually skip creating CI job at all, and then that would be a loss. So naturally, we look for things to automate. So this seems like the clear thing to automate. So instead of you going in and manually creating jobs around, why don't we just have Jenkins watch out for the branches, and then as it discovers new branches, we could let it create new jobs basically on the fly. And then that would be, in that way, even for a branch that only live for say 1 or 2 commits, you could get the benefit of the continuous integration. And also, for those of you who are using Git plugin, you might know that there's a way to make the Git plugin monitor all these branches. But if you do that, the build history and the comparison with the previous build becomes meaningless, because the previous build might be building this branch, the next build is going something entirely different. So the test failure, the fact that you have less test failure or the more failure, or the fact that the coverage went up or down doesn't mean anything because it's different branches. So the interesting problem when you start asking Jenkins to automatically generate the jobs is that, well, what do you do with the configuration of this job, right? I mean, it has to come from somewhere. In the easiest case, you might say, well, I just need to replicate a job from the main branch, and you basically have to do the exact same thing, just on a different branch. But in the more general cases, it becomes somewhat interesting. So what Stephen thought, Stephen made a leap of faith and basically came up with this idea that, well, this is meant to be making simple things simpler, right? This is about branching easier, creating CIs easier. So let's take that theme and then build on it by allowing people to just put a little human-readable description inside the Readme file, Markdown file, and then pick up the build from here, right? It's not very good at doing all sorts of complex stuff, but it's almost like actually by design, and it's a good thing because the theme, again, is to making simple things simpler. So in the earlier demo, I started with the already pre-existing definition, but here, actually, let me bring back to the original state. So here I actually have a do nothing, the Jenkins, the Maven project, right? It has actually nothing to do with Jenkins yet. So to benefit from the Literate, you have to do first create the the markup file, and then this is just to, I guess, to make Jenkins, treat this branch as a possible build targets, because sometimes you have branches, like in case of GitHub, you have a GH pages branch that's not meant to be built. So this would avoid that. And then otherwise, you just have to create a README file. And then, ACME project, this project is going to do something with foo. And then the trick is you just have the section named build, and then whatever text you can write, it doesn't really matter. So that's why it's called the literate builds. It derived the meaning from the literate programming, which is the Donald Knuth thing. You could sort of mix and the documentation code in very seamless way. So it's the same idea. So to build this project, use Maven. And the only thing that this plugin is going to look into is the indented section, the pre-formatted text block that describes the shell script to run. So I'm going to add this file and then just make this literate aware and then create this into the repository. So now, let me just throw this away and start from scratch. So now I have a README file, which is a good thing to have anyway. And if you're just looking at the README file, this is still useful information for human beings to look at as well. But this is actually enough to let Jenkins know what's going on. So let me create another project here in the literate multi-branch project type. So, and then specify the Git repository like I just did. And this is where you could actually tweak some other things, like, perhaps you're not interested in really building all the branches. Often there's a common naming convention for feature branches and so on. So you could specify these inclusions and exclusion patterns and all the usual things you'd expect. You could throw away the dead branches, since I also wanted to show it in the demo. I'm telling Jenkins to throw away the branch as soon as it disappears from the repository. So now it's now doing the build and then making my environment available. So this much I already talked about, but I guess to make this a little bit more interesting, let me check out a few more. Let me create a few more branches. There's one, and there's another. I'm going to just push them all into the repository. So now, since this is running on this laptop, I couldn't set up the push notification, but like I said, that's in production setup, that'll be the integral part of it. Oh, and I actually forgot to mention like one more important thing, which is how to install this plugin. So this is still in a beta testing. We are looking for the feedbacks because it's an opinionated feature. So to use it, you have to activate the experimental update center. If you come to the plugin manager, you should normally see, what you normally see is the one without the experimental. So there you have to add the experimental in it. And then you'll be able to install the Literate plugin, which in this case I already have. So this is what you're looking for. All right, so now I should have all the branches. So, well, I guess, yeah, right. So this I've already talked about, but it can actually do a little bit more than that. So let's see. So if you look at this particular project, it actually doesn't contain much because all it did was just doing the build. But for example, we probably want to have it collect the test reports. So what I can do is to create some additional directory, JUnit list, and then this file would specify the location of the test reports. So by being able to store the configuration of the build job into the repository, some of the things become very convenient, like you automatically get the same build environment when you fork the repository and so on. So activating JUnit. So this would activate the test reporting. Another thing you can do is if you're already using multi-configuration project, you can this Literate plugin can actually do a very similar things. So let me wait for let's actually verify the test reports here, which is in here. Again, the same kind of test report you anticipate from Jenkins. And you can actually do like a multi-configuration project equivalent thing. So to do that, I'll create another section called environments. And then perhaps say, let's say this project needs to be tested on 3 different versions of JDK. We test this on 3 different JDKs. And so the one would be Java 5, because some people still use it, believe it or not. It took a lot of heat when we moved on from Java 5 to Java 6. Java 6 and then Java 7, which is the current recommended environment. So again, the Jenkins would ignore all the textual part. The only thing it will care about is this, the quoted portion. And then, so if I commit this change, doing multi-platform testing, and then push this change into the repository. And once again, in the interest of time, I am just going to tickle Jenkins. Normally, we don't want to manually clicking around the build now button. But now you see that it noticed that there are 3 environments that's supposed to be tested, and it's running all in more or less parallel. So, so in this case, this Java 5, what do these Java 5 and Java 6 and Java 7 mean? In this case, they are actually the name of the configured JDK installation. So if you have any of these tool installation configured, then it will automatically match against these things. So I already have a 5 to 7 right here. But also, if you have a label by that name, it will also match that way. So if you might want to run the same test on Windows and Linux and OS X, and then you just have to match them up with the label, and you have multi-platform testing done all once. So that, I think, is what I wanted to, let me check my cheat sheet, but I believe that's all I wanted to show. So yeah, so I guess in this way, you really get to quickly enjoy the continuous integration on every branches without spending any efforts. So one of the things that I really like about this feature is, even though the whole thing is somewhat opinionated, some of the people might not see that the Literate style build description would fit their needs. But what's really useful is that it actually consists of multiple independent pieces that can be reused and extended on top of it. So that's one of the Stevens' genius. So the effort actually consists of 4 different plugins. And then so I wanted to quickly cover over just so that you know what kind of things we think could be possible on top of this platform. So the lowermost thing is called SCM API. So at the foundation of it, for this to work, we need to discover all the branches in a given version control system and figure out for every branch what's the revision, what's the commit that we want to look at. So these are optional interfaces for the version control system plugin that we developed called SCM API. And we have implemented this on top of Git Mercurial Subversion to begin with, and we are hoping that the other plugins would take advantage of this as well, like ClearCase or the perfluence, that sort of things. Another thing is that this notion of discovering branches and finding commits is actually general enough that it'd be useful, it'd be actually equally applicable for things that's not quite branches, like a pull request, for example. And it's still a bit different from branches, right? Or if you think about code review tools, like a review board for subversions, these, you can almost think of them as branches on top of the code base. And then so the same scheme could be applied on these plugins, and then we'd be able to suddenly take advantage of the Gerrit trigger plugin-like feature of automatically building every code under the review and providing that as a feedback kind of feature on top of Jenkins without people doing anything. So I think it's pretty awesome. Now, another layer on top of it is called the branch API. And what it does is it builds on top of the SCM API and create this notion of multi-branch project. It's a single job that people can create, which creates for every branch, for every interesting branch, creates all that children jobs. So the one that I demoed, every child job was that literate project type, but in this level, it doesn't make that kind of assumption. So we could build arbitrary things on top of it. So perhaps we can build the multi-branch freestyle project that offers the gory details of the flexibility. So it's more complicated, but it's more freedom. So there are all kinds of different trade-offs that we could make. And then when we are talking about all these different branches, there's some obvious things people want to tweak about. Things like how often you want to leave. Once the branch is deleted from the repository, how often you want to keep, how many days you want to keep them around, or you could make sure that the one branch is not going to occupy the entire development resources, and so on and so forth. And then there's also a Literate API, which is actually independent from Jenkins, and it's a pluggable parser layer. So, again, in the demo, I was showing the Markdown format. So you are writing the build description inside the Markdown file. But you could actually just as easily plug in a different parser like YAML or XML. So we are trying to gauge the interest of what format will really work better and so on. And then finally, the whole Literate plugin at the very top, we basically put together the whole thing and create the piece that you just saw. But personally, I'm really love to see the multi-branch combined with a freestyle project. Again, because maybe it's like a checking in the entire configuration XML inside the repository or something. And that way you have a full flexibility. In the Jenkins Enterprise by CloudBees, we have this template feature, which allows you to basically model most of the job configuration inside Jenkins. So perhaps, I see the ways to combine this with the multi-branch feature. Or maybe perhaps we would say there's no point in my case, in someone's situation, maybe there's no point in checking in the configuration file into the repository, in which case you could perhaps let Jenkins copy one job into as the example job, and then simply copy them over, which is often what people are doing anyway. So that's the sort of multi-branch features. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the mobile development. So while CloudBees has an office in Los Altos. It's actually pretty close from here. So we felt like we need to keep up with the good things coming out of Steven. So the Mark Pritchard is our tireless evangelist on the mobile development. So he spreads the mobile development lab inside and outside Jenkins. So his passion had sort of infested the rest of us. And we spent a lot of effort into creating the mobile development stories. So one of them is this landing portal page for the mobile pass development. So we have a complete open source application that has a kind of enterprise integration that we think the enterprise apps people would have to face, and then complete with the Jenkins integration work to do the over-the-air distributions and all kinds of things that was new to the former enterprise developers like myself. We spent a lot of effort working with other vendors in the community building plugins for them. So the mobile development, it's still an evolving space. So we have all these different companies, and they appreciate the ecosystem around Jenkins, and they want to be a part of it, but they don't have enough expertise to build the plugin. So, or they could use the code review on the plugin they wrote. So some of our engineers have been looking at these things and helping them bring their plugins into open source. So things I just flip through quickly. These are all open source plugins inside the Jenkins community, and I think of it as one of the CloudBees' contribution to the project, which is to bring these vendors into the Jenkins world. Now, but as we walk inside this mobile development space, we realize that the biggest elephant in the room is actually to automate the OS X build. Right? So at least half the ecosystem of the mobile space is around Apple. And if you're doing the iPhone app development, you know that to develop the iOS applications, you need to run build on site on OS X. And the Apple being a public enemy #1 for the automation, they actively go against helping people automate the virtualize and automate things. So seemingly simple things become incredibly hard in OS X. But this actually is a challenging problem. So I spent a lot of time and finally was able to sort of automate the virtualized OS X and then run it in the DevOps cloud. In other words, we have you can now build the OS X builds as a hosted virtual machine. So that's that is actually some truly that's quite an accomplishment that I wanted to mention a little bit. So here I have one OS X, a job named OS X. I guess it's not Twitter. It doesn't like this big font size. So I have a OS X job which basically just checks out the iPhone application from public GitHub repository, and then it'll run it through the Xcode build. So I have this is a public repository. It's a silly chess application, but the real build is in here, which is just uses the Xcode plugin to do the build. So if I run it, just like I showed you earlier by using this demo instance, that by running 10 builds at the same time, it's going to talk to your backend, which provisions a new virtual machine, OS X virtual machine, and then register that as a slave, and it will get the build going in no time. So now the machine is fully booted, and I think Jenkins is trying to put this machine under control. All right, so now it's almost getting there. And then once that's over, you can get the build going. So today, if people doing this OS X development, the iOS development using Jenkins, they have like a stack of Mac Mini, right, somewhere, and then that's where they maintain. But since these are physical machines, it's kind of hard to keep them in a clean state. You have to, did it come online? You have to sort of constantly maintain them, and the overhead of that is pretty high. But in the virtualized environment, you really don't have that sort of problem, right? So this is the main thing that it does. So off it goes. I guess the first thing, yeah. So so now it's now it's building in Xcode. So the whole thing works, and then you could go from the build to the over-air distribution with test flight and so on, without entirely on the cloud. So this is something we built. And then just to make sure that you get what we've done, this is not about having these like a rack full of Mac Minis, which is what people have, right? That you can do. But the real effort that went into it is to make sure that it's a fully elastic build slave that we could start up and tear down and then restart again from the known clean state. And then as we automate these OS X builds, we were able to sort of identify some of the other pain points, like the one, and then push it back to the open source. So again, for people doing IO phone development, they know that to do anything useful with the binary, you have to sign it. And then to sign the binary, you have to have these things like the private keys and certificates and all these things. And to prepare them properly on the build state is actually non-trivial effort, because you can never really sure how to capture them, how to re-import them when the certificate would expire and all these pains. So what we did as an improvement into Xcode plugin is that you can export. So if you go to the Xcode IDE, you have an option to export your identities, and it creates a zip file that contains all your private keys and provisioning profiles and all the other, like 4 or 5 things that Apple wants you to have. And then you could just upload this file, it's called .developer profile file, into Jenkins. And then once you do that, every time the new slave comes online and then you're doing the build, Jenkins would ensure that the slave would have the right key. So you have one less thing to worry about. You don't need to know about all the security chain commands and stuff like that. So there's a lot of active development going on in this effort. But it's now available for you to sign up, actually. So if you're interested in using this feature, you can go to cloudbees.com and /OSX and then sign up. I'm interested in people trying out some crazy stuff on OSX. So please try that. But the really awesome thing about, as exciting as mobile development is, I also realize that in the broader Jenkins community, it's actually like just one part of it, right? So what really excites me about this development is that this iOS development is just actually a tip of the iceberg. There's all the lower level work that we put in, which can be reused, and we are reusing it elsewhere. That's actually where the serious engineering effort went into. And it's just, normally we don't really get to talk about how awesome this underlying stuff is. So you just have to bear with me for the next 10 minutes or so where I ramble about all these awesome things that's happening behind the scene. So, I mentioned that the slaves are virtualized. So we put all these slaves inside a single big box, and we call that a mansion. I originally had a lot more politically incorrect names around the slave theme, but my colleagues knew better, so it's called mansion now. These are virtualized environments, but we are really keen on reducing the overhead of the virtualization. So when we are running Linux builds, which is by far the dominant platform people are doing builds on Jenkins, it's actually all these processes that from the different tenants. They are isolated, but they're actually running straight on the same kernel. So the cost of virtualization in this situation is almost zero. Yet every tenant get to see as if they occupy the entire world. And so this allows us to host lots of builds quite quickly. And in this way, the kernel would share the same kind of cache. If all these guys are running Java, we'd be able to consolidate these pages. There's a lot of across the tenants sharing that's happening behind the scene, which helps us in turn run things a lot faster. And the storage, we can get a lot better storage on top of these guys. Now, for OSX builds, we can't run it like that. OSX virtualization, as I said, is quite painful. But so we have to run them inside QEMU on the top of KVM. So it's actually run pretty fast because it's running on the real hardware, not on the virtualized environment. But the cost of the virtualization does get a little more expensive. But to cope with this, we use this awesome feature known as the kernel same page merging. So what this does is, if you look at all these individual OSX virtual machines that's running, they're actually almost identical, right? It's building the same kernel, loading the same module, starting the same program. So if you look at the individual memory pages of these guys, you could actually share them because they are the same. So they looked at the checksums of the individual memory pages, and if they're the same across the board, they replaced its copy by one same page. And then, and so in this way, we could actually share the substantial amount of the memory that the individual virtual machine thinks they are owning, and back into the smaller memory pool. So that allows, again, in turn, to give you more memory for the builds. So every OSX machine in our box gets like a 4 gigabyte or so of the memory. So that's possible with these technologies that really consolidate the amount of memory consumption. So that's only the part of it. That's this is only the execution and memory side, but there's also lots of magic that's going on in the storage side of the house as well. So for the storage, we use the GFS on Linux. It's somewhat ironic that the GFS being a technology originated from Sun, I only get to use it once I left Sun, which is quite irony, in this place, which is former Sun headquarters, which even adds to more irony. But so what the GFS does is really, it's a copy-on-write file system. So what we do is when we, the reason we have mansion is, so the mansion owns all the storage. It's a pretty big, like a pool with the multiple disks attached to it. And then we can keep your workspaces around, even when your build is not happening. So we are very keen on making people's build time go faster. And we noticed that actually a lot of times a large delay comes when you hit the build machine that doesn't have your warm workspace, because you have to then check out the entire source code. And anything that involves networks, like these ridiculously slow compared to things you can do on the CPU and memory. So by being able to keep your workspace around even when your build is not running, we'll be able to improve your build speed substantially. And in this way, we sort of assign the workspace to the running slave and basically on demand. And then so your data is secure and safe and all that. But it doesn't stop there. So this is where now the copy and write comes into play. But so say you're doing this multi-configuration project, right? So say you got this workspace that you need to build on, say, these 3 different versions of JDKs. So now what we can do is each of these 3 builds gets a different slave. But we can, say if you have a warm workspace, we can just create a copy on write clone of these workspace, which is like almost like an instant operation, and then give these individual workspace to the build slave. So every slave gets its own completely independent writable file system. So as they might check out some additional stuff, or they might produce a test report. So as the mutation happens, things get written into disk, but they only keep the differentials. The bulk of your source code is actually from the same files. So it obviously allows us to put even more workspace inside the mansion, but perhaps more important for you is that in this way, the kernel only has to keep like 1 cache of that file. It doesn't have to keep 2 cache of these 2 files. So they both get the benefit from the same kernel page cache, and so you don't have to hit the disk actually to load these things, again, which really helps your build speed go faster, because anything that involves disk is slower, right? It's like 100 times slower easily than the memory. And then this technique is actually also applicable in other things. So as it turns out, that a lot of people does Maven builds, and a lot of people rely on the same set of jar files, because like a commons IO or whatever, run-of-the-mill open source libraries. So what we are very much trying to thinking about doing by using the same infrastructure is we create a pre-populated Maven repository that, because we proxy all the requests, we know what files people access. We can create a local, fully populated local repository. And for every build, we can create a copy and write clone. This will be humongous. Like the last count, we had like a 24 gigabytes of jar file in this space, but everyone gets a fully populated 24 gigabytes of local Maven repository from which your build would go instantly, because you don't have to hit the central ever again. And then again, the same kind of the kernel cache should apply. So everything from Java processes to the jar files that you need to read, it's all on the warm cache in the memory, in the kernel page cache. So this is going to make your build run really screaming. So this is the kind of hard work that go underneath that you normally don't see. This is the degree in which you have to bend over backward to make your build faster. And I'm really proud of all the work that we are putting into here. And then I guess, so with that, I'm going to switch back to Harpreet.
All right, thank you. So it's always a challenge to follow Kohsuke, and he's the star. And so I was wondering what I would talk about here, and then I demoed what I'm about to demo to somebody who's just joined our team. So Steve Christo just joined our team, and I showed him, and he was actually completely silent. And I was like, all right, this doesn't look like it's going good. And then, I was like, what's your opinion? So it's like, this is the, pardon my American, coolest feature ever. So having said that, I'm going to get into that towards the end of the talk. So what Kohsuke mentioned with Dev at Cloud, right? So I end up talking to a lot of customers, and people have sort of genuine issues moving to the cloud. And they usually, the top three are sort of listed out here. So one of them used to be like, how do I access a particular custom stack that's not on, say, Dev at Cloud? And this used to be more or less about 60 to 70% of the people used to talk about this from a Mac perspective. And before, Kohsuke did this incredible engineering work there with the mansion work. Our answer here was, why don't you use on-premise executors? So that was one. The second one was like people were starting to use AMI images for their slaves. And there's this this is a subset of the previous case, but also there were some people who decided to move to the cloud on sort of Amazon EC2 infrastructure, and then they realized that they're now sort of managing Jenkins infrastructure, and that's not what they want to do. And the last one, I think the biggest one for us, the elephant in the room, I guess, was how do I access sources that are in my data center? It could be source code repositories or databases that are required for tests. What do I do there? So internally we call this sort of the hybrid approach to the cloud. You have some resources on-premise on your data center, and you want to use cloud, but primarily the cloud is driving things, and now you're sort of accessing some things. So with the Amazon stuff, it was fairly easy. We could come in and say, like, you can use your existing EC2 plugin and just connect that to the Jenkins master running on Dev at Cloud, and you're fine. For custom stacks, our answer was, and there's another subcase for custom stacks, and that was people had already invested a lot in their slave machines, and they just wanted to reuse that infrastructure without having to sort of just say it's all thrown away. So for that, we had this feature called on-premise executors, and all it does is there's a Jenkins CLI jar that we sort of publish, and you run that, and it makes a connection over HTTPS back to the Dev at Cloud master, and whenever there's a new job that has a label that sort of goes to this particular slave, the job is allocated onto that on-premise executor. So that's sort of what we had, and we have a number of customers actually using this in production. Perhaps the most exciting work here has been this feature we built called VPN to Jenkins. And this sort of solves that elephant in the room problem, which is how do I access resources that are sitting on my data center? And I apologize for the sort of condensed diagram here, but what we've done here is on the left-hand side, what you see is CloudBees. And we've set up you kind of go in and enable a VPN, and what that does is it starts a VPN daemon on a particular master. So every sort of customer can have their own VPN running, and in the configuration, you sort of give the CIDR a representation of your subnet and your IP, and it generates a configuration file for you. And all you have to do is sort of download the configuration file and start an OpenVPN client that connects back your network to us. And from there on, every build you can go into a job and sort of configure that this job actually depends on the VPN feature. And when you fire a job, the slaves actually can now connect to resources back on your data center. So with this approach, what we've done is, I think we've pretty much addressed a wide variety of our customers and prospects who were trying to move to the cloud, but they couldn't for these varied reasons.
And I guess in case I failed to mention this, but it's like a mansion work. We are trying to, the plugin on the Jenkins is actually, doesn't really depend anything on the other thing in the CloudBees. So we are trying to make it available to you so that you could install it on your own Jenkins instance in your desk, and then they'll be able to run the builds from the Mac OS slave or the Linux slave on the cloud. So we are trying to sort of fill every possible excuse people have between the connecting clouds and what you already have in your network. And this is just another example of that.
Yeah. So that's sort of what we've done on the Dev at Cloud side of things. I also sort of work on the Jenkins enterprise side of things with Kohsuke. And this is where we get into the coolest feature, I guess. My conversations with customers, if I have to sort of sum it up in the last year, sort of have gone this way, right? It's like people are like, I really want my organization, when I talked to them last year, I really want my organization to go agile, they need Jenkins, this, and 6 months later it's like, I have too many Jenkins masters within my organization, what do I do, right? So I sometimes feel like a therapist sitting there and listening to people. Now, with that said, they have some genuine issues, and I'm sure a number of you have encountered these, right? One is, if you sort of go beyond the developers and talk to the admins who are actually managing this infrastructure, and this happens quite a bit in medium to large size companies, it's like, how do I share resources? How do I share my executors, right? I have 3 groups that have gone in and set up their own infrastructure, and now engineering comes in and it wants a couple of more executors. There's no easy way to share. This is what I want to do. But what I'm actually doing now is actually sort of guessing the number of executors or number of slaves that I need and putting a purchase order for that. That's clearly inefficient, right? So I'm just spending money where I shouldn't be. The second one is, now each of these masters have their own security configuration, their own roles, and there's some person kind of trying to make sure that they're using these roles across, the organization-specific roles across these masters. And if you happen to be this admin who kind of goes in and is even has to log into these masters, you're keeping like a document that tells you where a particular server is, and you kind of go in and log in there, right? So the idea was, can you share these roles, and can you share the security realm easier, and can you sort of navigate between the masters? So what we worked on in the last few months, apart from all of the things that Kohsuke has talked about, is this feature called Jenkins Multi-Master. So it's a set of plugins that are installed on a Jenkins master, and it's called a multi-master server, for example. And then you have a certain set of plugins that allow you to connect a master to this multi-master server. So let's call that attached masters. So what ends up happening once you do that is, the slaves can be shared between masters. You can sort of push down security configuration from the multi-master server down to a regular attached master. Your attached master can sort of override some of the role information if it so chooses. They can share the same security realm. And then you can sort of have a single sign-on. So all you need to do is log into the multi-master server, and from there you can sort of jump back and forth between these masters. So with that, I have a few minutes to demo that. So I'm going to choose a. All right.
This is like a weird environment. My PowerPoint virtual machine. So.
All right. So what you see here is a multi-master server. The way you go in and connect a master is pretty much how you sort of go to a new job, and you say, I want to connect a client master, and let's say choose master, and let's press OK. And at this point, you can, one feature that I didn't talk about is there is an update center plugin within Jenkins Enterprise that lets you set up and manage Jenkins update centers easily. So you could have attached a particular Jenkins update center to the rest of to the master that you attach. So let's not do that. And once I press save, what ends up happening, it produces this hash that I have to go in and enter on the attached client master, so that these two masters, the server and the attached master, can talk securely. So I'm not going to do that. Let's just assume that I have done that. And if I go back to the Jenkins master, what I have here now, so here's like 2 folders, and I have an operations org and an engineering org, and there is one slave sitting up here. Now this slave is going to be shared across the masters that I'm just about to show it to you. So let's get into the operations org folder. Sorry. So what you see here is there's a master here called B team master. And if I go in, I'm now actually, if you can look at the breadcrumbs, and if you're paid attention to the, so if you look at the breadcrumbs, I'm actually on the attached master. So this is the master in the operations org, and there's a job here. And now let's just run this job. So once I do that, let's just wait up. What you see here is it has picked up slave 1, which was sitting at the the multi-master level, and it's using that slave. And that slave is leased to this master. It runs the build, and once it's done, it releases the lease back, and the slave goes back to the top level master. And if I go up, now let's look into the other organization. So here you have engineering org. And the engineering org, the scenario is slightly different. There is an engineering slave sitting up there, and there is a attached master here again. So let's build this job. And what you'll see is the master on this actually picks up the engineering slave. So if you can see down here, the engineering slave has been picked up. So what's happened is we go up the chain, we find the nearest slave that matches the labels and the requirements and use that. So if you could actually, in this case, if I had fired another build, because engineering slave was in use, it would have gone in and leased it from the global pool instead of picking up from the local pool. So if you had certain slaves that had, say, production environment information, right, you would at that point restrict that to that organization and use those slaves for these sort of production-related tasks and not get into the global pool. So you have the option of not sharing slaves as well. Okay, could you shift back?
So just in case it wasn't obvious, these are just a whole bunch of Jenkins plugins. So the multi-master is still Jenkins.
Yeah. So I guess what's conceptually happened here is the part that I didn't show you is the roles and security realm. In this case, I hadn't set that up. However, when you're trying to run this, the master was the slaves were released from this global pool, and once they were done, they were returned back. Right. So some things are fairly obvious with this approach here. Right. There is a centralized dashboard from where you can jump into all the masters set up in your organization. You're sharing resources. Right. You no longer have to. The way people were handling this kind of scenario when I talked to them was this place where, oh, I need to work across these organizations. Let me add more executors and keep adding more executors to a particular master. And then what happens is everything is way out critical on this master. And actually that's where our X1K initiative came out, because that's the most often the scale up thing that we see doing. However, in this case, you could just split your jobs across multiple masters if you want to. And now what happens is you can use the HA, the high availability plugin from us, and your multi-master can be highly available. And we suggest that you keep your jobs on only the connections to the client masters on the multi-master. So if the multi-master goes down, the slaves won't be available for lease during that time, but it can bounce up pretty quickly. And the slaves that have been leased out to the downstream masters can keep on running their jobs. So you've taken sort of, one level of complexity away, and sort of your infrastructure is not as, I guess, delicate, right? So that's what we've been working on, and this is slated to come out next month as part of our next Jenkins Enterprise release. And Jenkins Enterprise is available for a free trial for, I guess, 2 months, and you can download and play with it and give us feedback on how you think this feature is. Right?
Right.
So with that,
yeah.
Did you have any closing words?
No, I think it's I guess the kind of things behind the scenes is not often obvious, but this level of the vertical integration of different things is something we are really proud of. So, okay, so with that, that's it. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.